Ladies and gentlemen, our subject this afternoon is the economics of deflation. Austrian economics is economics. The only reason why we use the term Austrian is because of product differentiation. There's only one true economic science, as there's only one true physical science and one true chemistry and so on. And of course we believe that we are doing economics, whereas the others are playing games or indulging in fantasies. But if we sold this under the heading economics, people would get confused, so we have to use the expression Austrian economics. Austrian economics is therefore much better than the other fake or false economics in all areas, but it is especially better in money. As far as monetary economics is concerned, the Austrian economic is far better, far superior to any other approach. And that is essentially because the Austrians are the only group who have consistently developed monetary economics as it has been taught in the 19th century and in the 18th century, whereas all others have either abandoned monetary economics completely, altogether, or have subsumed it under the heading of macroeconomics. So they're reasoning in terms of aggregates. And nowhere this superiority is more important, both theoretically and practically, than in the analysis of deflation. Deflation is not only the horror of horrors, if you believe monetary economists. It's the number one nightmare of central bankers. Right? Deflation, that's the scenario that we have to prevent. It entails collapse of the economy, bankruptcy, a halt to production, unemployment, and whatever nasty things you might concoct and think about, all this is imputed to deflation. And therefore, no effort is big enough to prevent such a disastrous scenario. Deflation, therefore, the fear of deflation, is the most important element in the general case for central banking and for paper money. So there are various other justifications, but one of the most important ones, or possibly the most important one, is the fight against deflation. Because only central banking, and paper money in particular, allow us to increase the money supply to virtually any extent, thus permitting us to offset decreases in the money supply that might obtain elsewhere, in any case decreases of the price level that might result from any other circumstance. So the Austrians would have none of this, and this afternoon I will explain to you what the Austrian case is, why Austrians are not afraid of deflation. There are no deflation phobes. Among the recent Austrian literature, so the most important Austrian writer in this respect is Murray Rothbard. So from Rothbard you have to read. There is no, if you wish, we've discussed about this at lunch. Somebody asked me, I think you asked me, Mises, the theory of money and credit. In this book, Mises' account of monetary economics is inferior to the account that he gives in Human Action. So not only Human Action, which has been published almost 30 years later, first version of Nationalökonomie, is of course more mature, but it is in fact much better. In that respect, I recommend to you an article that has been published last year by one of our former Mises Summer Fellows, Nikolai Gurdjieff, in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, where he analyzes the differences between the theory of money and credit and human action, and shows that Mises, in this first book, left open various loopholes that could be interpreted as cases for government interventionism, and how he closed this in his later analysis. Based on human action, then, it was Murray Rothbard who most consistently developed Austrian economic analysis in the field of money, and here in particular dealing with the case of deflation, whereas Mises had reservations about deflation, so he was part of those who feared deflation and thought that monetary institutions had to some extent at least to be designed as to prevent deflation from happening. Rothbard was quite cheerful when it came to the prospect of deflation for reasons that I will discuss later on. And then in the past few years, there have been a series of articles have been written by scholars affiliated with the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And here I should mention in particular the articles collected in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. I believe it's volume 6, number 4, 2003, which contains a symposium on deflation, monetary policy and deflation. There are articles by Joseph Salerno and Mark Thornton, Philip Bargos, another summer fellow, and myself. And we also allowed a Keynesian into this to enrich the picture and show how tolerant we are. The general case on which the Austrians build the analysis of deflation is grounded in one of the central propositions of monetary theory. And that is a proposition only, unfortunately today, upheld by the Austrians. And this proposition is that the quantity of money ultimately does not matter. Okay? The quantity of money has no positive nor negative impact on the functioning of a market economy. And I will illustrate this thesis as discussing various scenarios in which deflation might obtain. So we will first talk about what is called growth deflation, and then turn to hoarding, then turn to the analysis of decreases in the money supply, then talk about deflation resulting from government interventionism, and distinguish this then from scenarios in which there is a flight from money. And finally, we'll come to an overall assessment of the economic and political significance of deflation. So first of all, the definition, what is deflation? There are certain people who accord great importance to the way we use words. And if you say, well, what is inflation? They say, yeah, inflation. The mainstream defines it as an increase, a permanent increase in the price level. Horror of horror, that's wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a wrong definition. Okay? Definition just concerns the way we use our language. A definition can be meaningful or not, right? It can just describe an object that really exists or something that is just a fiction, right? Then we would say, well, it's a bad definition, or it's a definition that is not useful. But as long as it concerns any tangible object, whatever, anything that can be verified, either with reason or our sense apparatus, well, there's nothing to be objected against the definition, against the use of words. So it is possible to define inflation as a permanent increase of the money supply, just as it is possible to define inflation as an increase of the price level. Okay? And so inversely, in the case of deflation, there are two current definitions. The one that is most widespread is a permanent decrease in the price level. Okay, that's the most widespread definition. And the other definition that we will also use is a decrease in the money supply. And it is clear how these two definitions relate to one another. Variations in the money supply are one cause of variations in the price level, right? Increases in the money supply tend to increase the price level, decreases in the money supply tend to decrease the price level. But of course the price level can also vary for other reasons, but variations of the money supply. And we'll talk about these reasons. So first we'll turn to the case of what is called growth deflation. And what we mean by this is the following scenario. We have a growing economy, and as I've explained to you on Monday, we have a growing economy in particular if we have positive net capital accumulation, okay, which allows us to extend the structure of production, to make production more roundabout, and therefore more physically productive. So as a consequence, there's a greater quantity of goods and services offered on the market in a growing economy. And growth inflation obtains if the money supply does not grow to the same extent as this growth of the quantity of goods and services, And for convenience sake, I will assume that the quantity of money does not change at all. So we have a constant money supply and a growing economy. What will happen in such a case? Well, the price level will shrink. Right? Because at a given money supply, if we want to sell more goods and services, this is only possible if the prices decrease. Now let's illustrate this with a numerical example. You find such an illustration of this sort in Jean-Baptiste Saussaye's Treatise of Political Economy. You have one, let's say now, this is my example here, we have one tomato and tomato and one tomatia, one TV set and one car, let's say. And in our first economy, let's say it's economy A, a tomato is worth or sells for $1, a TV set for $100, and a car for $10,000. And in this economy, we have an overall quantity of money, let's say, of $1 million in circulation. Okay. Now, if we have another economy, we have the same economy, and we just imagine that the only thing that changes is the quantity of money. Let's say it is now $2 million. So the money supply increases, and the result will be that the prices for the different goods and services increase as well. And for convenience sake, and I will amend this later on, for convenience sake I will just assume that the prices will be exactly double what they had been before. Why is this so? Why do the prices have to increase? Well, because the increase in the money supply per se does not mean that the other goods have increased as well, right? It's not because I turn on the printing press and print a couple of dollar notes that at the same moment, and for this reason, the pop-up TV sets and cars and streets and various other things that could be bought with these dollars. So the increase of the money supply is not the same thing as the increase of these other things. The other things, right, the quantities of these other things are modified according to other circumstances. We can, for simplification, assume that they remain the same. Right? And then a greater quantity of money is spent on the same amount of goods and services, and as a consequence, the prices will be higher. And the inverse would hold true in the case of a decreasing money supply. And we would have different figures. Now I said that I would amend this. It is very unlikely that the prices would be modified in exactly the same proportion as the change of the quantity of money that intervenes. And that is because the quantity of money, as Professor Hülsmann has explained to you on Monday, enters the economy at distinct points. It is first in the hands of some individuals, and from there on spreads into the hands of other individuals. So it's not the case that, for example, this additional million that comes into place is at the same point of time suddenly in the pockets, in proportional aliquot rates, in the pockets of all those who are already owners of money. Rather, it goes to some market participants first, and from there on spreads throughout the rest of the economy. As a consequence, some prices will increase before other prices, right? And thus some revenues, some individual wealth positions will be affected relative to other individuals. So as a consequence, money always has a real impact on the economy. Okay, so that's a very important axiom of monetary economics too. Variations of the money supply have a real impact on the real economy. They are not just reflections. They're not just a veil, as some classical economists said, not just a veil superimposed over the real economy. And these effects, so the fact that money spreads in the economy in time and affects different prices and revenues to a different extent, this is called Cantillon effects. Now, this is fairly a static consideration and fairly mechanical, and it's plausible as far as it goes. But there's one objection that invariably comes to the mind of most people if they consider in particular if they consider a growing economy. So here we're just considering changes in the money supply. Now, if we assume that these quantities themselves are modified, if there are more tomatoes available, more TV sets and cars, etc., then it follows, for the same reasons as here, that the same quantity of money being exchanged against a greater quantity of goods and services, the prices will decrease. Now, most people wonder how this is possible. How is growth possible in such an economy in which prices decrease? Wouldn't we assume that the entrepreneurs had increasing difficulties reaping a profit at ever lower prices and so on? And there's a very simple answer to this question, and it consists in pointing out that entrepreneurs can anticipate the evolution of the price level, and in particular the evolution of their selling prices. That's a fundamental notion. So anticipations come into the picture. To the extent that entrepreneurs anticipate the falling of the price level, they will right now, in the present, when they buy factors of production, adjust their bidding to these anticipated prices. Okay? So let's say we have here a production process that's spread out through time. And before, let's say, it looked like this. The entrepreneur invested 100 ounces of gold and then sold his product for 110. So he was making a surplus of 10 ounces over the initial investment. And now let's assume we have a growing economy, so he expects to sell the same quantity that he produced before, only for a price, let's say, of 90. Okay? So what will he do now? Well, he will right now, when he comes to the factor markets, that if he hires people and if he buys machines and cars and various other ingredients that he needs for his production process, he will offer only a lower price. Right? He cannot offer 100 because then he would make a loss. So he would offer less. He would offer, for example, let's say 84 or 85, and thus still continue to produce with a surplus. Okay. Now we might say, well, but what if the owners of these factors are not ready to sell to him at this price? Well, wouldn't he have to close shop? Of course he would. Yeah, he could not continue his business. But what does it mean that they refuse to accept these lower prices, ladies and gentlemen? It means that they have a better offer somewhere else. Okay, that's what it necessarily means. The prices that we pay for factors of production are dependent on the alternatives that the owners of these factors of production have. If they can sell their property somewhere else for a higher price, well, then they will not work for us. Right? So if some other entrepreneur thinks that he will not be affected by the general fall in the price level, and that is possible, right? It does not affect all firms to the same extent. Well, then he will hire people and rent machines and so on that before were used by other companies. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly how it should be. Right? So that's the selection process of the market. That's the market process. That's exactly how it should be. But of course, if we have a real process of growth deflation, that is, we have a growing economy and the quantity of money remains the same, remains stable, then such a case in which entrepreneurs can still uphold their old prices will be exceptional. In most cases, entrepreneurs will have to reckon with lower selling prices, And that means that the owners of these factors of production that are needed will not have any alternatives. Okay? They cannot turn elsewhere. So they will accept the lower offer. They cannot but accept the lower offer. And that means, therefore, that we can have a continuing production process in continuing growth at an ever-decreasing price level.
Wouldn't there be a natural human tendency to just not sell at all in the hopes that maybe next year or 3 months from now I could get a higher price? I mean, wouldn't deflation be a little stickier in terms of adjustment than, say, inflation?
No, I mean, here psychological factors come into play. But of course, if you pursue this policy, then you run the risk that others are occupying your markets. Right? So, you cannot just sit on your ass.
Isn't this operating on the assumption that everybody knows that there's no monetary expansion whatsoever? I mean, you essentially, for people to operate effectively, for entrepreneurs to make those educated guesses, because that's what they are,
Yeah.
everybody needs to know that there's no central bank, there's no way to expand the money supply.
Exactly. Very good observation. Yeah. Very good. So therefore, right now,
is it a reasonable anticipation to assume that there's going to be perfect information in the market?
No, in the market, the information is never perfect. I mean, first of all, information is less important than one might think, as I've explained this morning. So it's rather entrepreneurial judgment that comes here into place. And entrepreneurial judgment adapts to the circumstances. Of course, if you have a central bank in place, if you have paper money, well, it's very unreasonable to speculate on such an event. Right? And that's also the reason why mentalities today are such that everybody expects just an increase in the price level, never a decrease. And that's not irrational, that's very rational, faced to the institutional framework. But we are here just considering this possibility, and it is very important to consider this case because it shows us that there's no inherent reason why this should be impossible. Right? And if we look at the historical record, we find indeed that there have been periods of important economic growth that went in hand with a decreasing general price level, and in which, therefore, the growth process has operated exactly in that manner. Entrepreneurs bidding down the prices for factors of production, not so much labor, for reasons that I cannot discuss. Now I can come back on this later, but especially for the material factors of production. Such periods have existed most recently, that's already a while ago, at the end of the 19th century in both Germany and the United States. Right? It has been at the time called the Great Depression. Right? The Great Depression, because it extended over 20 years from roughly 1873, there was a big banking crash then, the money supply shrinked, until the mid-1890s. And only in our century the word Great Depression has then been used for a different historical event. So this is not only a theoretical possibility, but has been verified by concrete historical episodes that is possible. So we conclude from this, in particular, that it is not necessary to adjust the quantity of money to the growth of real goods and services. Right? And here I emphasize this because this, what could be called adjustment idea, is very widespread. Right? Adjustment idea or correspondence idea. Lots of people who think, unfortunately among the economists, who think that the quantity of money must somehow reflect the underlying value of the goods and services that come to be offered on the market. Right? This, of course, presupposes in turn something like an objective value theory, right? That the value of things could be determined independent of the money supply and so on, but we won't go into this. Right? So we hold back this proposition. Growth is possible with a constant money supply. It is not necessary to adjust the quantity of money to the variations in the supplies of real goods and services. And we can illustrate this maybe again with our numerical examples here. A lower price level is not inherently more or less advantageous than a higher price level. At a lower price level, now from the point of view of consumers, the prices are lower, but their revenues are lower as well. At a higher price level, their revenues are higher, it's true, but all the prices that they have to pay for factors of for consumers' goods are higher as well, so they're not better off. Right? So from the point of view of consumers, a higher price level has no advantages vis-à-vis a lower price level, and the other way around. Just doesn't matter. Now let's take the point of view of producers. So here we have this dynamic analysis. Now we take the static point of view. From the point of view of producers, it's true that at a lower price level, their selling prices are lower, but their buying prices are lower as well. Right? And at a higher price level, it's true, their selling proceeds, their revenue is greater, but their cost expenditure is greater as well. So that's what we could say, assert about the aggregate. Things get a little bit more complicated if we take into account these dynamic aspects that I've discussed before. Okay, so we have the first case here, growth deflation, that has permitted us to discuss some of the most important aspects of deflation. And we can now come to another case, which is hoarding. So hoarding is a different cause, or can be a different cause of deflation of the price level. Right? Secular growth or growth deflation is one cause. If we have growth at a constant money supply, this entails a decreasing price level. If people start hoarding at a constant money supply, this entails a decreasing price level as well. Now, what is hoarding? Ladies and gentlemen, usually have the image of the miser, right? Horrible tales of horror told in the Middle Ages and so on. The miser who just sticks to his money, so he hoards the money in his pockets and it never leaves them, and so. But this notion becomes a little bit fishy if we consider that all units of money are ultimately held in somebody's pockets all the time. Okay, it's true that I hold my money in my pocket, and some other you see how high the salaries are at the Mises Institute. You see, and some other money in my bank account and so on. But every single money unit that I own, I hold it. So I'm hoarding it in a way. So what does it mean that I'm hoarding? How can I hold a money slip more than I already hold it? How can I increase my hoarding if I have it in my pocket? I just stick more to it? What it means, ladies and gentlemen, is, and that is the more scientific, the more sober expression, we have here an increase in the demand for money. Demand for money. Or in shorthand, MD goes up. What does this mean, increased demand for money? Well, it means that I value money differently relative to all other goods that I could also hold. Okay? Where do these valuations come into play? They come into play whenever I buy and sell money or other pieces of my property on the market. So first thing to notice, we cannot discuss the demand for money independent of existing money prices. Okay? So let's assume we take the position of an acting person, and before his demand for money increased, he paid the following prices. He worked 1 hour and exchanged this for, let's say, $10. Worked 1 hour for $10, and he paid $5 for a movie ticket. These prices are valid only for Auburn, Alabama. Okay, let's take just these two figures. Now, what does it mean that his demand for money increases? It means that he now prefers to hold greater quantities of money rather than other quantities. So he is therefore ready to offer greater quantities of other things that are in his possession in exchange for the same quantity of money. Which could mean, for example, that he's now willing, let's take an extreme example, that he's willing to work 2 hours for $10. Okay? And that is, demand for money increases means also, so he sticks more to money, he prefers to hold greater quantities of money relative to other goods, that he will no longer be ready to forego $5 in exchange for a movie ticket, but maybe he will only pay $4. That's the maximum price he will pay for the movie ticket. If he cannot get it for this price, he will just not go to the movie theater. Stay at home and buy other nice things like peanuts. So what does this mean? Now, if we look at the figures, it means that the exchange rates, by the very fact that the demand for money has increased, have brought about an increase of the purchasing power of money. Right? Before, $10 bought 1 hour of labor, of his labor. Now it buys 2 hours of labor. Before, $4, before $5 were necessary to buy a movie ticket, now it's $4. Okay? So by the very fact that his demand for money has increased, the purchasing power prices decrease, and so the purchasing power of money increases. And the increased demand for money is satisfied. Right? So we have here an automatic mechanism at stake that makes that variations in the demand for money are satisfied by variations in the purchasing power of money. Conclusion, we never have to worry about hoarding. Right? From an aggregate point of view, if we look at the economy as a whole, we never have to worry about hoarding. Hoarding is a problem for individual entrepreneurs, right? Because of the Cantillon effects. Right? There are always some individuals who will first have a higher demand or maybe a lower demand for money, and as a consequence, their changed behavior will affect certain entrepreneurs first, and they may, as a consequence, go out of business. Okay? But this only means that the factors of production that these entrepreneurs have been using so far will now be available for other entrepreneurs. Right? The factors of production have been used by the entrepreneur because he paid the highest prices. Now he's no longer capable of doing this. So they will be sold elsewhere at lower prices. New companies become possible. There's no aggregate problem, in short. Right? So hoarding, it entails the same kind of problems as a growth deflation. In the growth deflation, from an aggregate point of view, there's no problem whatsoever. There might be problems for individual entrepreneurs because they might be affected before the others will be affected by the phenomenon. Okay? So individual entrepreneurs might go out of business, but that means always that other entrepreneurs will now be able to come into business. And hoarding has exactly the same effect. Hoarding can mean that individual entrepreneurs go out of business, but that means necessarily that other ventures become profitable that were not so before. So never worry about hoarding. Okay, so these were, this discussion referred more narrowly to variations in the price level. Now we come to variations in the money supply itself as one of the causes of variations of the price level. And so we'll talk about the impact of a decreasing money supply. MS goes down. We may call this deflation in the narrower sense. Being understood that growth deflation and hoarding entail deflation in the larger sense of change, modification of the price level. Now, this case can be very quickly dealt with because, by and large, what we have are the same consequences that we already discussed. A decrease in the price in the money supply will make all prices go down. Okay, all prices will decrease. And as a consequence, entrepreneurs will now realize only lower selling proceeds, that's true, but on the other hand, they will also have to pay only lower prices for factors of production. Right? So again, from an aggregate point of view, no problem whatever, right? But because of the Cantillon effects, because of the fact that the money supply decreases first somewhere, right, for certain individuals, it will entail problems for individual entrepreneurs. So they might go bankrupt, but if they go bankrupt, their factors of production will be sold elsewhere, thus rendering possible new business ventures that were not possible so far. So even deflation in the narrower sense is not a problem. And we can now, I should observe, so what are the empirical cases in which there can be such a thing as a decrease in the money supply? The most important empirical cases are decreases of the money supply in the larger sense, that is in particular of what is called bank money. Somewhat confusingly, bank money. So if we have a gold standard and fractional reserve banking, then there are situations, as we know, in which banks have issued so much banknotes that they run into difficulties redeeming all these banknotes. So it is necessary then for them to reduce their issues in order to be liquid again. And this invariably entails, or is the same thing, as a reduction of the money supply in the larger sense. Such situations have existed historically after great wars. Inflation, extension of fiduciary media during a war is an important means of war finance. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars, but also World War I. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Bank of England has increased its supply of notes and then started redeeming these notes after 1821. And that was possible only after it had substantially reduced the supply or the circulation of its notes. The same thing happened after World War I in various countries. The United States is one of them, England another, Sweden, Denmark. And all these countries, they actually reduced the note issue, has entailed a deflation springing from the reduced quantity of money. And again, we observe precisely what our theoretical analysis leads us to suppose, namely that there was no major macroeconomic problem, and we had an adjustment period because people had to adjust their expectations and also adjust their contracts and so on. But this adjustment period took from 9 months to 3 years. 3 years was the most. Okay, and then it was done. So we had so far 3 causes of deflation. Now we come to a group of causes that is interesting from a political economy point of view, namely interventionism, government interventionism. And government interventionism can cause deflation in 2 ways. First of all, by confiscation. And second, through price controls. Confiscation, this case is clear, right? So the government just seizes money holdings belonging to its citizens and thus reduces the money supply. This has happened quite a few times in the history of money and banking, in particular during the 20th century. In Germany, we had it twice, each time after in the wake of a monetary reform, after 1923 and then after 1948. So government seized the bank accounts of its citizens in order to prevent inflation from manifesting itself. Okay, and that was not the only justification that they came up with. So most recently, we had the same thing going on in Argentina. Right? Argentina, the peso crisis. The peso was devalued vis-a-vis the dollar, and so the Argentinian citizens rushed to their banks to convert their pesos into dollars, right, and withdraw their dollars from their bank accounts. Until then, they had the right to hold either pesos or dollars as they liked. And the government then just closed the banks and froze the accounts and prevented them from withdrawing the money. So it reduced artificially the money supply. Result, deflation. Right? Now, the particularity of this kind of deflation through government interventionism is that it is less, it cannot be as well anticipated as the other forms of deflation that we've been discussing before. Right? In particular, the most important practical case of deflation, growth deflation, can be fairly well anticipated. Right? If you have an economy operating on a gold standard, then it is known usually years in advance what the overall changes of the money supply would be. Mining is a very time-intensive business. Right? It takes about 15 years right now from the search of a new mine to the full development of this mine. The major time was maybe not 15, but 7 years at least. So you know 7 years in advance at least what the money supply, what the evolution of the money supply will be in the foreseeable future, and as a consequence you have ample time to adjust to the circumstances. If the government intervenes, there's no way to anticipate this, certainly not 7 years in advance. Right? They can change their mind from one day to another and decide to confiscate money holdings or various other assets as an emergency measure, and you don't do anything about this. So and if this intervenes, of course, you get something like mass bankruptcy. Okay? Now let me emphasize again that even in this case, mass bankruptcy does not mean that we have a major problem here from a macroeconomic point of view. What happens in the case of a mass bankruptcy is that the existing owners are replaced by new owners. Okay? So we have a structure of production, we have firms and business units operating within the economy. If all of them go bankrupt because of an unanticipated decrease of the money supply, right, then they still can be operated at this lower price level. Right? They can still be operated from henceforth. Right? The problem why people go bankrupt is if they have contracted debt in the past. Okay, so that's usually why they go bankrupt. So we need to discuss this in this context very shortly. So let's assume, take the same numerical example here, and let's assume that, take maybe a little bit more drastic figures to make this convincing. In any case, higher figures could be used as well, because these questions of bankruptcy and so on often play at the margin. So let's say our entrepreneur operates with a credit of $1,000, right? And he can pay, he can serve the debt on the basis of his return of 10. Okay, so very long-term credit and so on. Now the price level decreases. Okay, the price level decreases, and he has just a surplus of 5. With the surplus of 5, he will be, let's assume, he will be incapable of serving this debt. Now there are two ways out of this. The first one is renegotiating the debt. Right? So his creditor might agree to reduce this figure here to 500. After all, he also profits from the fact that all prices have dropped now, so the purchasing power of these 500 corresponds roughly to the 1,000 before. That's fine. On the other hand, he might also insist that he be paid in full. Okay? Legally, this he would be in his right. So what happens then? Well, then our entrepreneur here goes bankrupt. Right? He's out of business, and the creditors take over. Okay? The creditor, he will never recover all of his money, but he now has the company. And he can operate the company profitably at the new price level. Okay? So this means, now we come back to this macroeconomic consideration, this means that even in the case of mass bankruptcy, what happens is a replacement of the entire, let's say, class of entrepreneurs and businessmen by other individuals. But the business units themselves can still operate profitably at the lower price level. Okay? So again, we have no macroeconomic problem here, even in the case of completely unanticipated events government interventionism. I'm running out of time, therefore I will step here this case of price controls. The most important example for this is Gresham's law for the experts, and I will talk more about this tomorrow in my lecture on legal tender laws. Okay, so where does this leave us with? I can summarize the preceding discussion in two propositions. The first one is deflation does not entail any economic problem. Okay, there's no economic problem whatever with deflation. Right? In the worst of all cases, deflation requires or entails a situation in which all entrepreneurs, all existing entrepreneurs, go bankrupt and will be replaced by new people. Okay, but for the great mass of people who are not entrepreneurs but employees, nothing will change. Whether they are employed by Mr. Schulz or by Mr. Meyer, that doesn't make any difference for them, right? And they can still go on leading their lives. So there's no economic problem whatever. The real problem is a political one. Right? The real problem is that, well, deflation, as all other changes in the economy, affects individuals. Entrepreneurs who are owning a business or running a business do not like to be replaced by somebody else. Okay? And if we have something like deflation, which is therefore a mass phenomenon, we can have, by the same token, by token of the same fact, we have an incentive for all the existing owners to collude and to form a lobby, right? And intervene at the government and ask the government to do something about this. Right? We are the leaders of the country. And what will they do without us? Need to stay in place. In this context, I might mention the conservative aspect of John Maynard Keynes' monetary thought. Right? So Keynes, of course, thoroughly despised by true economists, and he deserves so. But what is interesting, so he is known as an advocate of inflation, and so on, but what is less well known is are the motivations that prompted him to this. In order to know these motivations, you have to read his earlier works on money. He has a treatise on money published in 1930. That is not quite as revealing as the two other books that he published before, Indian Currency and Finance, and a treatise on monetary reform, 1923. Okay? And there he has a very thorough analysis of this whole economic process, which by and large is acceptable, right? Even in our day. And he realizes what inflation details. So it details a replacement of the existing elites, of the existing establishment. Okay? And now Keynes is utterly convinced of his own necessity. And who else could lead the country? Right? So we need to do something about this. Well, that was the main case for him for government interventionism, for government running the money supply. He saw very clearly that strong inflation was disruptive for society, and therefore he thought that deflation had to be contained, not for any economic reasons, but for its sociological implications. Right? Strong inflation entails strong redistribution effects, right? Making people rich at the expense of other people. He didn't like this. Right? All kinds of weird newcomers, weird newbies, entrepreneurs rise to the top. It's out of control. This process cannot be contained. And deflation has very similar effects. Deflation destroys the existing economic establishment, especially to the extent that it is in debt. In fact, all of the British aristocracy was in debt. So it has to be prevented. So what we have then is the second proposition, that deflation is a major political problem for the existing establishment. There's no economic problem, it's a political problem. And that's the reason why deflation is difficult to sell, and deflation is so despised. It has nothing to do with any economic considerations. It does not make the economy operate less efficiently. It does not reduce growth, and all these other stories told about this is all not true. The true problem is that it is an all-out direct attack on the existing economic and thus political establishment. There has been in fact only one acceptable criticism of deflation on economic grounds, and this criticism has been expressed by Professor Hülsmann, both in his book on capitalism and then various other occasions. And Hülsmann argues that deflation should be avoided because in such a situation in which we have a systematic bankruptcy of the existing establishment, the process of turning the existing companies over to the creditors would take too long. So Hülsmann argues that it would take decades to sort out all the legal problems involved in determining who is the owner of what in such a circumstance. Now, if we look at the record empirically, look at those periods in which such a thing happened, we do not observe such a thing. Rather, what we do observe is that these problems have been settled in a fairly quick manner. The last time this occurred on a large scale was in the early 1930s in Germany, and these issues were settled within a few months. Right? And even during these months, during the time of legal uncertainty, the companies kept producing because otherwise they would have to renounce the revenue. Right? So the revenue was needed anyway. So I don't find this argument convincing. Rather, so the overall evaluation of deflation, of systematic, of massive deflation, is that it entails a process that can be called with Joseph Schumpeter, a process of creative destruction. For what deflation does, usually, is to destroy the existing inflationary monetary institutions. Okay? The banks that have created the fiduciary media, the central bank that has issued paper money, all of this vanishes in a deflation, is destroyed. And so we have destruction. Right? The existing establishment, that is those people who were responsible for the creation of the system, disappear, they lose their economic basis. But we also have creation because other things come into play. Right? If the existing monetary institutions are destroyed, go out of business, well then other people will come and serve the market participants, right? Miners, gold miners, 100% bankers and so on will offer services. People will use foreign currencies and so on. And so something more sound than the existing institutions that have wrecked the economy so far will come to it in its place. I will leave it here and leave you 5 minutes for questions. Yeah.
I'm sure that people here have thought of this, but probably a good example of how businesses and consumers adjust to falling prices, in contemporary terms, would be various electronic devices.
Yeah.
I mean, computers, cell phones, almost anything like that. It's just fallen dramatically in price over the last 15, 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. And even that's done in the face of ongoing inflation. But, you know, I don't think anybody here has a problem with understanding how that works, how you adjust that through advertising.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a well-known example, and everybody likes it because we see this the whole matter from the point of view of consumers, right? So we're all happy about the lower prices. But most economists, they would not talk about this, they would talk about production problems, right? The problem that always comes up is, well, how can you produce with a profit in an environment in which prices decrease constantly, right? And here, Austrian analysis, emphasizing anticipations, expectations, points out this process. That's absolutely crucial to understand growth processes in a growing economy, in monetary processes in a growing economy.
I have two quick questions. First, if he invested $100 and it was only $90 at the end of the cycle,
Mm-hmm.
that $90 would still have the purchasing power, presumably, of the old 110.
Mm-mm.
Right?
No.
Oh, I thought that was the implication, is that it was a deflation across the entire economy.
No, look, I mean, if you don't anticipate the drop in prices, let's take the more extreme example of the 55, okay? You invest 100 at the beginning, and you only get 55. Right. The 55 have a higher purchasing power than the 110 before, right. But that doesn't help you.
Well, because of the debt. Because
exactly.
Of the debt, but if you exclude the debt aspect,
yes.
purely entrepreneurial.
Very good observation. Yeah. So this problem only obtains in the case of debt. If you have an entrepreneur that has financed everything out of his own operations, he will not be affected by this process at all.
Right.
So that's also very important, right? So the existing establishment will be replaced. Then I mean those who have been thriving on bank credit and paper money. Okay.
Now, as far as bank credit goes, this is another thing. If you have reasonably predictable growth deflation, does that mean you conceivably will have negative interest?
No. Cannot.
Well, not in economic terms, but in nominal terms.
No, it cannot be nominal. No.
You would pay back $90 for borrowing $100.
Look, I mean, the interest rate cannot be negative in nominal terms because then you would rather keep your money in your own pocket. You wouldn't lend it out.
If I anticipate that $90 tomorrow will be worth more than $100 today.
Yes. You would still keep it in your pocket because it would still be worth it.
Okay.
Right?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
What would, on the anticipation, what would be if you took that out, made that a constant, if the Fed were to continue to inflate the money supply, but do it at a completely predictable manner, every month they do this much and everybody knows about it, what would be the the leftover problems that would remain that managed anticipated? If the economy, if you eliminated the anticipation problem, would everything be okay, or is there still something, would there still be misallocation of resources?
At the beginning of my talk I said, so the fundamental proposition in monetary theory is that the quantity of money does not matter. Okay, for the overall functioning. Variations in the quantity of money they transform the real economy, but the quantity of money as such does not matter in the aggregate. That holds both for deflation and for inflation. Right? So the increase in the money supply per se is not harmful.
Well, what about the people who get the money first? I think it was Rothbard who was saying that whoever gets the new money supply first takes advantage of it the most.
That's right, yeah, but that holds true for any production. Right? If you are producing chairs, then you, as the seller of the chairs, you reap first the benefit from it. Right? And from there on it spreads to other parts of the economy. So the real distinction here is not between, who profits and who profits last, who profits first, who profits last. The real question is it licit or not? Right? So if you make such a first profit business by fraud, then there's something wrong with it. And that is ultimately the story that Rothbard should have emphasized. Yeah.
Just to try to get this straight for myself, are you trying to say that deflation is at least not bad? Not that you're not necessarily jumping to say it's good in any necessarily?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not worse than inflation. So, or more, let's put it very precisely. Decreases in the money supply are not worse than increases in the money supply, and they're not better either. Right? Because it does not matter, right? From an overall standpoint, increase and decrease in the money supply don't matter. They affect different individuals, right? But who are we to tell which entrepreneur should be in business and who not?
So you're saying if the entire market, there's a huge reallocation of resources because people can't pay off their debts or something since money's deflated. You're comparing that by saying, well, what if there are 10,000 of those people and there are, say, 1 million consumers, though, in terms of inflation where there's a price increase that are hurt somewhat to a far lesser extent. You're saying that kind of equilibrates, or is kind of equal in the cost on one side isn't necessarily greater than the cost on the other?
Well, we cannot, because costs are subjective, we cannot compare costs to benefits, right? What I say is the following. You have in any such change entails advantages for some and disadvantages for others. Okay. If we have a case of massive bankruptcy of entrepreneurs who have been financed with debt, that entails major adjustment problems. Okay. So you can have unemployment and so on. What I say is that is not that can be considered as a cost, but it's not something that is sheer destruction. There's certainly a destruction process going on. But it is counterbalanced. On the other hand, there's another side to it, namely creation. What is created is a new monetary, or at least potentially, a new monetary environment. What the deflation destroys are the very institutions that have created inflation. Okay, And so we can say, okay, it goes in hand with certain costs and adjustment problems and so on, but it also has great benefits. Now, why is this so important? It is important because, as we know from all countries, from the US to Germany, France, and so on, in all democracies, the political establishment seems to be incapable of performing any reforms. Okay, so deflation is, so to say, the natural reaction of the economic system of self-cleansing.
So the creative destruction is solely the destruction of firms that make the money and affect them.
Yeah, and of the very institutions that have created such a situation, which so many people have operated with debts. Okay, without.
It's not that any firms outside of those institutions would go out of business because the relative difference in the purchasing power of the deflated money would not enable them to repay their debts. Would that equilibrate kind of?
People who are not indebted will not a priori be affected by deflation.
But like businesses take on debt, they're leveraged.
Yes,
And so how does that play out?
well, the reason why they take on so much debt is because we have fractional reserve banking.
But would those businesses go under too, or just the business?
The business owner, the business itself could be continued.
With the business owner?
The business owner would go out of business.
You still have the machines, you still have the land.
You still have the physical production facilities. Right? They do not disappear. The knowledge of the workers, the knowledge of the management does not disappear. All that happens is that the existing owner goes out of business because he can no longer pay his debt. So you have other people coming in place.
Unless the new people want to run a liquidation value.
Okay, we're a little over time already. I thank you.